Hey guys, just taking a look at the last chapter and what we need to be doing with the special senses. And because this is the end of the school year and everything, we can get further into it. We can get maybe not quite so much in just kind of an introductory. So we'll see how this all goes. I do want the reading guide taken care of, and so make sure you get that done. And I'll get a due date in there. I'm just recording this ahead of time, so we'll get a due date for that shortly. But if we take a look now and the notes that are actually within this chapter, I just wanted to touch on a couple of this because this gets a little bit technical at the very beginning, and then later on we just go into diagrams into some disorders, so it's not too bad. But when we take a look at sense organs, when we take a look at maybe temperature sensors, maybe sight and sound, they all work in kind of the same ways. First of all, these are just nerves, and so they're nerves that are specialized according to modality, to the type of thing that it actually responds to. For example, if we take a look, the optic nerve itself, that just plugs into the back of the brain and in the occipital lobe. And so if you put pressure on there, you hit the back of your head or whatever, your brain will interpret that as light. Okay. We see stars, we bang our head or whatever. So one thing that your brain will do is take a look at what type of message is being conveyed here. And so they'll interpret it that way. Certainly, you could find some weird things, applications where the brain gets confused by that. So if you stimulate one thing, it messes it up and translates it as a sense of smell. You might hear of some people that actually see music, or just weird things that at first sounds kind of out there, but then on the other hand, it's just a nerve. It's just one of those things that's being translated in different ways. So you have different tumors, you have different disorders based on what's being interpreted. Your brain will also take a look at how big a stimulus is. Now, again, this is kind of one of those weird things where we have just an electrical stimulus. It's not like some of those other light switches that have a little dimmer switch. It's not like the nerve can do that, or the brain could sense that something is getting stronger. So what it does is it takes a look at how big a stimulus might be in terms of distance. So you have on your fingertips, we have these things that might interpret something as far as 2 millimeters apart. And sometimes it's maybe like 1.5 centimeters apart, and so on. So your brain will actually interpret how big a stimulus is based on how closely packed those nerve endings are. We find that basically as a stimulus increases, maybe the nerve would fire more frequently. Okay, that makes sense. We might find another way that the brain would know that a stimulus is getting bigger is by bringing in more nerves, or maybe your brain would interpret just how many nerves would be actually sending that signal to the brain. So there's at the base end where we have more nerves bringing in to register that stimulus, but also at the receiving end, we have more nerves actually bringing in that same message. So those are ways that your brain could know that a stimulus is increasing. And here's the opposite end of that. If the brain is just interpreting this message, at some point it kind of gets it. And we don't want to be overwhelmed by messages. So the brain is starting to actually ignore a message. If the stimulus is staying the same, it's just like hot water. So you stand in the shower, it's really hot at first or really cold, but you kind of get used to it. Really what that is the brain is saying, okay, the nerve actually is not firing as much because it's the same message all the time. We already got it. Same thing with smells. We did all of their sections, and at first it's really overwhelming, then you don't even notice it because it's the same. It's not intensifying, and so on. So those are the things that your brain will do when dealing with modality and location and duration and intensity, and how we interpret those messages. That's the big take home with this chapter. Now, we can also take a look at other things. Here we have specialty types of nerves. We know that our sense of taste, for example, or sense of smell are due to nerves called chemoreceptors. Okay, body fluid composition is another one in terms of like oxygen levels or carbon dioxide levels and so on. We have other nerves that are responsible just for heat and touch, thermoreceptors. Here's our pain receptors, what we call nociceptors, or mechanoreceptors, or photoreceptors. And we have specific types of photoreceptors. Some are just responsible for light and dark. Some are responsible for like specific colors or wavelengths. And this is how we know that animals might be able to, like for chemoreceptors, this is how we know that cats can't taste chocolate because they don't have that specific type of chemoreceptor. You just look at it and you know. This is how we know that some animals are colorblind. We look in their retina. Oh, they don't have those actual cones. They only have rods and so on. So yeah, it's not guesswork. We know because we can actually see those nerves and you just look at the morphology of them. Now, Where the stimulus comes from is also important. If it's an interoceptor, okay, what that means is it comes from the inside. Okay, so these are going to be the pain, the nausea, the stretch, the pressure, those types of things from internal organs. Kind of broad. Sometimes they get mistaken for other types of pains, so they poke and prod and do those things because we don't know where it's really originating. Interoceptors is more of a general type of thing, and so it's sometimes hard to actually pin down. I'm going to skip proprioceptors for a second because it's opposite of the interoceptors, the exteroceptors. Those are the pain receptors or just nerve receptors on the outside. And so they're very localized, very specific, and sometimes a lot sharper. And so we things like vision, hearing, taste, pain, those types of things are all what we term exteroceptors because they are nerve receptors to the outside environment. Then we have ones specifically kind of trapped in the middle of those two called proprioceptors. These are the ones that actually give feedback for our body orientation. So if you're spinning around and doing all those things, your body kind of loses track of where am I versus how is that matching up to what my eyes are telling me and so on. Somebody that has car sickness or seasickness, the body is moving, but it's really not in conjunction with what the eyes are registering and so on. So if you have some focal points that are not moving, it's not the entire world that's moving, it's just you. And so proprioceptors are the things that will give that feedback for position and body movements, okay, and coordination of that. Now, we have other ways of describing and classifying these, where they're distributed, how they're distributed. We have the synesthetic senses that are all parts of the body, just kind of general that way. Or we have what this chapter is really all about in the special senses, limited to very specific areas. You know, when we say special senses, it's because they're localized to one specific organ or system. Okay, so that's how this works. Now, nerves in general come in three different types. Okay, we have our pain receptors, what we call nociceptors, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we have the other ones called unencapsulated, or the open ones. These are ones that are going to be a little bit more specific for hot and cold, pain receptors, tactile, the Merkel discs, and so on, the hair receptors. Now, the reason they're unencapsulated is because if you think of the nerve with a little cap, and so if they don't have that cap on there, what does that translate to? It means that it's going to be a little bit more receptive to that, a little bit more twitchy. So think about one little thing that grabs one little tiny hair. It could be crawling on you, no problem. You don't feel it until it hits one little hair. Then all of a sudden you can feel it. That's an unencapsulated. That's going to be a much sharper and much more specific type of response. The encapsulated ones have like a little glial cell on top that actually connects it, or connective tissue that sits over the top. So these types of senses that we see, pressure receptors, the light touch and textures and so on, they're a little bit more specific. It's a little bit harder to decode. And so we have to sit there and kind of think about it, process it a little bit. It's not as fast acting, if you will, or not as receptive, not as quick to fire. So they are encapsulated. Just take a look at the examples of those and be ready for them. So we've described some of these when we talked about the skin, because those receptors, these are types that would be encapsulated. Again, what I would recommend on the test is just saying, think about how quickly is that to respond? How receptive, how stimulated is this? Is it going to be a little bit slower, a little bit duller, or is it going to be really sharp and really quick and really easy to do? Now, we take a look at one more thing. This is a little bit more detailed than we need with pain receptors, but I want you to see that we have one term in here called bradykinins. This is actually a chemical signal. So you have these pain receptors. If they get fired, they release a chemical called bradykinins. That bradykinin then picked up by other parts. And so that kind of moves up the spinal cord and gets moved along those ways. So actually, our sense of pain is actually a chemical reaction, as well as a nervous reaction. And so when you have painkillers, they don't actually kill the pain. What they do is they block the nerve's reception of the bradykinins. So you have things, you go to the dentist and they give you some Novocaine or something like that. The nerve is still firing, it's still doing those things. It's just the brain is not picking up on that stimulus because the bradykinin absorption has actually been blocked. Now, we have some other special senses and so on. This goes into more detail. We're going to focus a little bit more on specifically with our sense of hearing and our sense of balance and our sense of vision. And so I just wanted to point out a couple things because we're going to move into some diagram work. On the vision portion, obviously the retina is going to be the portion that holds all of those photoreceptors. We have rods that are going to be for the night vision, the light and dark, and we have the cones that are also in there for the different versions of color. Okay, so if you're colorblind, you obviously have a defect in the cones themselves, and maybe it's a specific type of cone or all the cones in general, and so on. So we're going to be seeing those types of things, those receptors built into the retina. Now, when we talk about our hearing, there's going to be a chain reaction, and so I'm going to bring you to the diagrams in just a moment. But we're going to see the chain reaction. It's all mechanical as we go through. So let's take a look now at. I'm just going to back up to our diagrams, and I want you to fill out these diagrams. You're going to have to know how they work. We first of all see that the light is going to come in through the cornea. It's going to actually shape that down a little bit. We see the fluid in here, but the light is going to be moved through the iris. Okay, and so the iris will go big and small, regulating in how much light goes through. We have the pupil, that's actually the opening within the iris, and then the light is going to hit the lens. Okay, that lens will scatter the light and then refocus it. So then we'll get a beam that goes right onto the back of the eye. Hopefully, it's all perfect in how it's aligned, and so we get a nice sharp image right here. This is going to be the region of the sharpest image or vision, and so that's right on the retina, stimulating it. So the rods and cones are then going to be responding to the light, making an electrical stimulus that goes out the optic nerve, going up to the brain, into the occipital lobe of the brain to interpret and translate. Now, this is kind of weird because as this focuses onto the retina, that image is actually inverted. And so it's upside down. All lenses do this. Even as you look in a microscope, if you move the slide up, the image goes down. That's because of lenses. And so your brain will have to actually, because it receives that image upside down, your brain has to actually translate that to right side up. So dyslexia and things like that, sometimes it's people, their letters are getting upside down and backwards. It's actually because the brain is having trouble decoding that. It's kind of a weird phenomenon that way. Now, when we hear, obviously, this is all, like I said, mechanical. Okay, so it's mechanical sound waves going through the air. It's going to vibrate the tympanic membrane, which vibrates on the inside of the ear, vibrates these three bones. Okay, do not call them the hammer, the anvil, the stirrup. That's middle school. We have the actual terms for those. Okay, so watch out for the incus, the malleus, and the stapes. So watch out for those specific terms as you're labeling up the diagram. And notice where I've got the pages on there, 457, 458 for labeling those. So the sound waves are going to be going through, and it's going to vibrate the tympanic membrane. These bones are attached on the backside of that, so they're going to be vibrating, and they bang against this oval window. The oval window is of the cochlea. So on the inside of the cochlea, we have all these little hairs that are the nerve endings. So the fluid gets vibrated, and so the fluid inside here will vibrate the different nerve endings at whatever frequency, and so they will fire and make an electrical stimulus that goes out the auditory nerve. Now, the brain will interpret that as sound in different pitches. What can happen for disorders is that those get damaged, or maybe, like I said at the beginning of all this, maybe the message is so constant that the nerves actually stop firing. That's the problem when you wear earbuds too long or whatever. You'll actually cause deafness because of that. Now, there's actually another nerve system that goes right on top of here that's dealing with proprioceptors, and that's going to be your semicircular canals. So the same concept that we have a fluid and we have these nerves in here, these little hairs, but when you move your body at, x-axis, y-axis, z-axis, as you move around in the three-dimensional space, those fluids will shift and basically cause those nerves to be fired. That stimulus also goes out through that same, they fuse into one, and your brain will interpret that as your body orientation. So people that have different disorders, it'll try to basically the brain isn't quite getting the message. My body is doing this, but it seems like I'm doing this, and we match it up with our eyes. So if somebody gets really spun around really quickly, they get really dizzy. Watch their eyes. Their eyes will sit there and keep on moving as if they're still moving. And so the brain has a tough time when you're really dizzy. Has a tough time getting that orientation in space. You watch the people that are gymnasts, the divers, and so on as they're spinning and doing things. They always snap their vision right to one standard spot so they don't get dizzy. They get the brain gets that feedback as to where they are in space. Now, this little tube down here helps to maintain that pressure on the inside of the ear and the outside of the ear. This is the eustachian tube, so that tympanic membrane doesn't bulge and get pushed out and basically block off that entire pathway. Now, there's only one other thing I want you to do in this chapter, because you do have some other things with the reading guides that walks you through that. But I do want you to go through and talk about the different things behind the different disorders that are associated with the eyes and associated with hearing. These are ones that you hear about all the time. So I want you to take a look at these pages and see what is this all about. Amblyopia, I don't have a page specifically for that. This is to amble about means to roam about. It's a wandering eye. Okay, so look that up a little bit. But I want you to go through actually the anatomy behind what is responsible for each of these and talk about within our terms of what's going on with the eye mechanism and so on, how we do that. There's one other thing that I want you to take a look at in this particular chapter. This is actually kind of a fun one. Unfortunately, if you're seeing this, we're not going to be doing this in class. But this is actually a really cool one that I found that's actually a dissection of the cow eye. We would be doing this in class normally, and it really walks you through how do we see this. So I want you to watch this video. I actually, when we are dissecting it, I bring this video up in class. You guys dissect as this person is going to be dissecting it for you. So, kind of watch this so you get a sense of what it is. And this will help you to understand how is the eye put together, how is the ear put together, some basic things about the special senses just in general terms, and you're going to be labeling up the diagram and talking again about some of the disorders on this test. Okay, that's going to get you through everything for this chapter, and good luck, and we'll be visiting with you soon.